So now, without further ado, tonight I'm very excited to welcome Deborah Paredez, celebrating the release of her new book, American Diva, Extraordinary, Unruly, Fabulous. For many of us, the word diva calls up figures like Maria Callas, Diana Ross, and Mariah Carey, powerhouse performers who don't do stairs, stadium-filling artists who demand a bowl of M&Ms backstage with the red ones taken out. Paredez is out to reclaim the term, using the women who have impacted her own life, as well as the voices that help define her identity. It's a list of legends that includes Tina Turner, Grace Jones, Celia Cruz, Rita Moreno, and Paredez's Aunt Lucia. Paredez shows how divas empower their audiences and challenge American ideas about gender, sexuality, performance, and freedom. And she does so in poetic prose that will have you dipping into the book again and again. In short, American Divas brings the house down. Deborah Paredez is the chair of the Columbia University Writing Program. Her work includes 2 books of poetry, Year of the Dog and This Side of Skin. She is also the author of the critical study Selenidad, Selena, Latinos, and the Performance of Memory. She is the winner of the 2020 Writers League of Texas Book Award and the Alfredo Cisneros del Moral Writing Award. And she is going to be in conversation with Gayle Wald, a professor at American Studies at George Washington University, who also knows a thing or two about divas herself. She's the author of a biography of Rosetta Tharpe called Shout, Sister, Shout, and It's Been Beautiful, Soul, and Black Power TV. Please join me in giving a big diva-sized Union Market welcome to Deborah Paredez and Gayle Wald.
My clock that will never. Thank you, Wally Judge. Whoa. Right. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with Deb Paredez. I am such a fangirl. Really, not kidding. I have so enjoyed this book. You need to buy this book before you leave tonight. You need to really buy all of her books. I'm such a fangirl. Anyway, I'm so happy to be here tonight. And I have a whole list of questions. I have a whole list of questions that I wrote out because I thought a lot about this book. There's a lot. This is an incredibly rich book. It is part memoir. It is part kind of investigation of diva discourse. You learn a lot about different diva women and girls in it. So you learn about kind of biographies of different performers. It's got a lot going on, but it's also like kind of organized according to your life. I don't know how you do it. There's a lot of threads going together. So I'm going to start with, we mentioned your Tía Lucia is like the muse for this book. I'm calling her muse. That's not your word. She's the auntie who reveled in her diva-dom and also modeled being a writer for you because she sent you all of these letters over the years. And there was a detail in the beginning that just slayed me, talking about Tía Lucia sending you, with her diva-dom, her larger-than-lifeness, but also her resourcefulness, where she would, when she didn't have stationery, she would cut out the cardboard from a decorated tissue like box and use it as a postcard to send to you. That detail, like, ooh, it seemed like that was kind of like the essence, like one of many essences. You meditate on the idea of the diva, that idea of like kind of incredible fantasticness and resourcefulness, ordinariness, like tethered to like extraordinariness at the same time. I'm teeing it off.
Excellent. Thank you
Tía.
so much. With Tía. Thank you so much, Gayle. Everyone should buy Gayle's work. It's really brilliant. And she's based here in DC, so you can access her many times in all ways. I find that divas often, the example that you use of my Tía cutting out the tissue boxes to send postcards, divas often find a way, right, to excavate the beauty or the wonders out of the everyday, and they lift the everyday, like to that space of extraordinariness or, of the sort of magical. And I think that that's part of what their allure is, right? They live in a way that's kind of grand. And so that, like Midas, everything they touch kind of gets swept up into that grandeur. And I think I learned from her how important that was to do for women of color in particular, right? Women who are historically disregarded, who the world is never going to insist upon. So like, what does it look like if you insist upon yourself in this way? And I think she was that first teacher for me. I mean, and of course she was much maligned in the family, right? Because they're messy, just as much as they make those beautiful postcards out of the tissue boxes, they'll run off with your money, or, they'll, be misbehaving, right? Because they're living outside the boundaries of the norm or the normative ways of being, or gender, or the confines of, propriety.
There was another part that gutted me. There's in your discussion of so there's a chapter on Tina Turner. So the chapters are in different divas for the most part, and they kind of, there's pairings between divas and kind of elements of your own formation. And in the chapter on Tina Turner, you juxtapose the story of Tina Turner and her incredible comeback career, going from being part of a duo to kind of having a solo career in the 80s. And you juxtapose her story with the story of your father as a Vietnam veteran with PTSD. And that's something that you explored in Year of the Dog, the poetry collection. And you juxtapose them as both, in a sense, survivors of trauma. And the line that got me here was, his silence is the current that pulled me toward writing and toward Tina. The diva's loud. Can you talk about silence?
Sure, absolutely. I think that, there's many ways to be a diva. And I think that part of the excess of the diva, right, filling the space with her voice, right, I think often can fill the silences, right, that we have in our life, or that can allow us to give voice to that which has been silenced, right, because the diva is so big and the voice is so transcendent, right, can literally transport us beyond that. And so it can fill the silences that are often unbearable to have to bear, right, as a result of violence and war. But also sometimes I think that the diva, because sound is often so central to a diva, at least many of the ones I talk about who are singers, it also, I think, they understand how to play with, how to sort of use silence sometimes as the way to, like, sometimes you let the silence happen and then you know when to punctuate it with the right sound, right, at the right moment. So I think they have a relationship to when the space should be filled and when they should, there's a chapter that it killed me to cut out about Lena Horne. We can talk about cut chapters later.
That was a question. There's got to be what's on the cutting room floor. There's
a lot on the cutting room floor, but she did a lot with silence and reserve, and there's been great work written about her by Shane Vogel, but about what she withheld,
yes,
right, as a way to handle the very intimate space of the cabaret with white folks kind of clawing at her, and reserve and withholding became part of that kind of diva persona. So that there have been divas who also work with that, I think, as well.
Yeah, that withholding bit seems really important. It has to do with the erotic dance of the fan with the diva.
Absolutely, because divas, the thing about them, because they hold so many contradictions, as much as they give, they also withhold. And it's partly like, oh my God, we want them because we can never quite have them because they're always removed from us a little bit, or a lot. And that reserve or that withholding is also part of the dance, right, that the fan does with the diva.
So the book American Diva is not just about divas and not just about you. It is also about a kind of history of the discourse of the diva, or the history of the ways that people talk about the diva. So one of the things that you chart is the change between the time when you're growing up and kind of, listening or watching some of these figures for the first time, and a turn that I think you begin to plot, maybe in the late 80s or the 90s, where diva becomes kind of commercialized, it's appropriated, it becomes a kind of, it's kind of reduced of some of its poignancy and its specialness. Can you talk about, because that's also an important piece of the book is kind of tracking that and a critique of the way that diva is often used today as a word. I see you're like looking at the picture of Beyonce over there.
I know, how fitting. So, speaking about divas,
Another
in Capital,
chapter.
another time. Yeah, during the course of our lifetime, we're about the same age, right? I talk about the fact that diva, when I was young, was reserved often, for better and for worse, for, usually for opera singers, right? Rarefied singers who had these larger than, kind of supernatural voices and larger than life kind of attitudes or lives themselves. But that I noticed as I grew up, and certainly I noticed in the 1990s when I was beginning to work on the Selena book, that I started feeling like the word was everywhere, right? That it started proliferating, and that I felt also that it began to change in its, in the way, in its tenor, in the way that it was sort of tossed about. And so I decided, like any good professor, right, student, I decided to chart the usage of the word, like through Google Ngram, and through New York Times word, sort of charting the word. And I realized, I learned that in the 90s, the word proliferated by like 400%. It increased the sort of everyday usage, or the sort of popular usage of the word. And I thought, well, what the hell is that about? And as I began to investigate, I learned that it was also happening in a moment when kind of ideas of feminism were somehow also popularly getting disavowed. The idea of post-feminism started to rise. So there was both an embrace and a repudiation of feminism in the popular sphere. And diva kind of flooded in to kind of mark that kind of, oh, we're going to be like women power, but really we kind of hate women, simultaneously. And it became used in that way, so that it was a way of, yes, kind of giving a nod to the woman in public, but really it was a way of expressing anxiety of like a woman in public doing either really excellent things or perhaps behaving in ways that were outside the norm. And then it was also the proliferation of like the pop diva moment that we see, certainly the Britney Spears and the Beyoncés emerging. And so I think all these things came into play, especially in the 90s, and diva became a way to mark, and especially, I would say, women of color often as excessive, yes. Right? And so it became a point of derision for women, and particularly yes. Black women, right? Who historically had been excluded from the term, right? Because it was only for like these virtuosic white women. And now it was labeled, but as a term of derision. So I was pissed about this. So I said, I got to write about it.
So much to say about that. I mean, one thing is, I guess maybe to go back to the idea of the appropriation of divaness, and you talk a lot in the book about kind of neoliberalism and the idea of taking, in some ways, removing the messiness from the diva, so that a diva is just a striver in a kind of individualist frame, rather than a larger than life figure who is flawed and also excellent at the same time. But it's something that you notice, especially when you become a mother and you have a daughter and you see the ways that diva is being marketed to her. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it becomes also infantilized.
Yeah, absolutely. I had my daughter in 2009. So, but in that decade just before, in the 1990s, many of you are too young to remember this, but, there was like the Buffy kind of figure, this sort of, girl power, Spice Girls, like totally like that kind of can-do girl, superhero girl. And it gets slowly replaced, as we see with the rise of Hannah Montana or things like that, by the girl whose secret superpower is really that she's secretly a diva. Her superpower is like she's like a performer, really. She might be everyday and ordinary on the surface, but really, in her secret life or in her alter ego is the diva. And I started to kind of track like how this stuff was being, very much how the tween market was beginning to form in the early 2000s, and how that tweenification of culture and girls became marked by like ideas that said, hey, if you're a successful girl, you're a successful diva. Like, and so that means you have sparkly things. You talk, we've talked about the kind of idea of sparkle of, ways girls get sparkleified, literally in that moment. And that became the marker, and of course, again, that's also racialized and classed, of a kind of successful girl, and especially a tween one, right? That you can secretly sing and you have to kind of be out there and have these accoutrements of like excessive femininity that were specifically tied to a diva identity. So suddenly diva became how to be a successful young teenager. And the market for products, I had a whole research assistant whose only job was just to chart all of the products. I mean, that took her an entire summer.
It's kind of a fun summer.
Yeah, it's a fun summer. It was a fun summer for her, but like the pages and pages in that Google Doc and the links to all of the diva curtains and diva manicures for tweens and, diva makeup, on and on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still trying to puzzle that out.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to something else that you said, which is that the diva was an exclusive term, was racially exclusive. It was maybe culturally exclusive too.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kind of, there was this moment when it seemed to also be potentially derogatory term. It was to mark an unacceptable woman.
Yes.
I'm wondering about, and the divas that you figure in American Diva are mostly Black and brown women, all Black. There's a few men in there, cis men. And I wonder if you could talk about, as you already said, the Black and brown people, but perhaps women in particular, not only behavior socially policed, but culturally represented in terms of excess and outrageousness. And I wonder if you could talk about why the divas are so important as portals or figures of potential or freedom for Black and brown fans.
Absolutely. Part of what compelled me to write about divas and to focus on these particular divas is often when divas were spoken about, it was often either, a kind of rarefied white diva, or again, as I said, diva was used to kind of deride, the pop star or whatever. And for me, I found that actually, if I look at my own history of listening, if I look at the sort of history of the role of Black female performers, right, in Black culture, in the kind of freedom movements, right, even more broadly, wow, there was like somehow always a diva in there, right? And so I thought I really want to turn our attention to looking at these women. The other thing that I think sometimes happens with divas or performers of color, women of color, is that their talent is often it's often relegated to, it's just natural. Yeah. It's not actually as a result of profound training or a huge tradition, whether it's in the church or beyond, or in Nina Simone's case, like all kinds of places, right? And so I wanted to also categorize these women as divas who are in fact technically excellent, right? That there's a virtuosity here that comes from training, even if it's maybe not traditionally legible. And so part of that was wanting that to happen, and also to reveal how, for example, with the case of Labelle, this, most amazing transportative group, transformational group, that for communities who are listening to Labelle, many of them Black and brown, many of them, if not most of them, also, queer communities in the dance, in the disco, there was a way that their music and their personas provided a space of congregation, provided a space to think about, what does it mean to be free sexually? What does it mean to be free? If we think about Lena Horne, doing the work she did, what does it mean to be free as a people? They were always there, right? Even if they weren't singing, right, which is often their role, their very personas were instrumental in those drivings. How to be free in my body, right?
Yeah. And Aretha Franklin seems really central to this. And I'm thinking about Aretha Franklin as someone who, her talent is almost fetishized sometimes. But who was also kind of was regarded, and now we're looking at her in the haze of kind of her passing, and that changes the way people remember someone, but was often accused of being difficult, right? And I think about, kind of the idea of difficulty and why as a Black woman she was called difficult, and how that also had a story to it and a context. For example, Pay Me in Cash, what that was about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so the kind of using Diva in some ways to erase a history rather than to surface it. And I love that. I mean, have you seen someone seen the YouTube? If you haven't, run to the YouTube after to see Aretha Franklin's performance at the Kennedy Center Honors. That moment.
I teach it.
Oh my God. Because I cry every time I see it. And I don't know why. Do you know why you cry? So there's the moment for me. I don't know when you cry. When she, if you haven't seen it, she comes on the stage wearing like a fur coat.
Yep.
It's a whole coat. And she puts her pocketbook on the piano. Mm-hmm. People don't always see her playing piano. So it's like a special moment because Aretha's at the piano and singing. And then at a certain point, she stands up. And then at the point that always gets me is when she just she doesn't even take her fur coat off. She lets it drop. I wrote about this actually myself in the context of women and fur.
Yes,
but I don't know why. Why do I cry when I see that?
So I think there's a lot of reasons. So she, in that moment, is it's supposed to be a moment to honor Carole King, who of course is the composer, wrote the song, right? Natural Woman, that of course we all know as Aretha's song. And I think in that moment, there's a lot of things happening. One, I think we cry, I cry. I start my Divas class every semester with that moment. One, because it's extraordinary virtuosity, right? We see that, and we see it coupled with longevity, right? So that it's greatness over time, sustained. I think there's that. And that the dropping of the fur is a kind of unfetteredness, that we see embodied. We see also that she came in with her fur and the purse. I always talk about it. It's I just got out the car. Okay, you want me to play? Okay, so that there's this sense of, that's a Tuesday for Aretha Franklin, right? That's performed there. And I think what you see this moment in which, even though it's supposed to be, honoring Carole King, who I love, it's right, but Black folks have made something their own forever, right? For a long time that wasn't, a song written by the white girl, but she was able to make something her own and we understand that what we're seeing is the history of that particular process too, and we also see, because of the way it's filmed, you see the fans, you see their reaction, and you see the acknowledgement of a kind of profound respect and love that is so hard-earned and that is rare, for a Black woman to experience, and that's part of why we cry.
People in the audience are literally
I know, it's like a hurricane is coming. Yeah.
And I like to think, and it doesn't really matter, but I like to think that she didn't rehearse that at all. Yeah. That it's a moment of possession, but also dispossession, taking the just dropping it.
Dropping the coat.
But
right, and that she could drop a fur,
and slay everyone.
And that again, right, that she could drop the fur because it actually, that there's a sort of sense of flight that happens, right?
Yeah. Can you just to kind of sit with the idea of the difficulty of the diva and her beauty? Yeah. One of the points you make is that kind of as important as the diva is as a inspiring isn't really the right word. Inspiriting? I don't know.
Yeah, that's great.
Something different? I don't know. Figure, you're careful not to idealize or romanticize the diva as always a figure of feminism or a figure of, an uncomplicated projection of what it might be to occupy the position of the feminine.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. The thing about a diva is that part of what makes her a diva is she's singular, right? There's no one else like her. She's kind of, where did she just came out of the ocean on the, on the seashell, she's singular. And so part of that singularity, right, and that investment in her singularity can mean she may not play well with others, right? But also that she's not connected sometimes to others, like there's only space for her on the stage, right? That's a little bit part of why there's sometimes a kind of uncomfortable relationship to a larger kind of feminism as we might think about it. I also so there's that part of the persona, right, that often makes it an easy alliance. But I also think that it simultaneously helps us, if we really are dedicated to feminism, understand that if we love a diva, we love a woman in all of her complexity, right? In the messiness, in the parts that are imperfect, in the parts that can scare the shit out of us because she's so good at what she does, right? And to not be afraid of that. And that does encourage, like you have to really be, to be feminist and not like relish in the misery part either, like in the part that's not imperfect, because that can also be misogyny. I think it can encourage us to think about women in a particular way that feminists try to help us do.
That makes me think there's a dynamic with fans too, because when I think about kind of casual conversations, fans of divas will often say, "I forgive her."
Yes, absolutely,
so
I forgive her.
There,
Yes.
and that idea that it's a kind of generosity. You don't have to be perfect for me. I don't know what that means that a fan would say, "I forgive you," because it's like obviously like who cares?
Who cares?
You don't have the right to
You don't
forgive. But
any space
does
for
that resonate for you too? Like, I forgive her. She's
Yeah.
been a little crazy lately, but it's okay.
Right. Or we feel, I say this about my Tía Lucia, like sometimes you just feel like, contempt, but you also have the love, like that it teaches you how to hold the both of those emotions in regards to women who are, taking up all that space. And I think that there are fans who are absolutely going to be that way.
And we live in a culture where it's hard to love women. It's hard to love women of color. And so to kind of demand, to the degree that the diva demands that love,
that's right,
is so powerful.
And that's part of her difficulty, right? How she's rendered difficult because she demands love. She demands space. She demands to be paid in cash.
Time.
She demands time, right? And to be paid in cash again
Celia
is about
Cruz coming on at 1 a.m.
Yes, exactly. But to be paid in cash is also about the history, history of Black folks not getting paid. But I think that there is that part of it that that being difficult just means she's insisting upon herself, and yes, sometimes it might seem overmuch, right? And okay, but we love. If you're going to love her, that's part of what you also, expect or not expect, but accept. Yeah. And again, I think that to love a diva can also, and I say this in the book very clearly, loving divas helped me love and not fear women who were excellent and messy at the same time, right? That's not a thing that many people do, or we're not encouraged to do.
Right. Well, it's so it's such the antithesis of the neoliberal the girl who overcomes by being excellent and sparkly and working hard.
And perfect. Yes,
it's really different. It's easy to love her because she doesn't demand anything of us.
That's exactly right, and she's going to be a kind of model of goodness and achieving and aspiration that's very kind of linear and not outside of the box.
So I want to switch gears a little bit, and since we're a small group, if people have questions, you can just give me a little wave, but I have a lot of questions. So you talk about the public and the private in your discussion of Grace Jones, another fabulous diva, and so I want to talk a little bit about your process. You're a poet. So poets like to talk about process, don't you? We do. So in that chapter, you talk about Grace Jones kind of obliterating the boundary between the public and the private, making us feel uncomfortable because there are things that are supposed to be private, that she makes public. You also take risks in this book. As academics, you don't get a PhD and learn how to disclose anything about yourself. It's quite the opposite, right? That it's training in how not to talk about yourself, even though that's all we do. But you took risks in kind of, to the degree that there's memoir here, you took risks. And I'm kind of curious about, was it, in a sense, I'm guessing that, your subject demanded that of you, or maybe you gave yourself, they gave you permission. I don't know how you thought about it.
It's a great question. Yes, I learned how to write this book by really listening and trying to listening to and using the divas as models for how to be in the world, right? Also, I wanted to tell a good story, right? And so I've learned from, teaching in the creative writing program at Columbia, I'm also around amazing nonfiction writers, Margot Jefferson, people who are really playing with the memoir form in new ways. And so I read a lot of memoirists who are doing interesting things. Hanif Abdul Karib does is a wonderful way, a model for thinking about that as well, although he doesn't teach at Columbia. But I think that I wanted to perform the effects divas had on me, right? Not just in the past, but even in the writing. And so it meant being imperfect. It meant being messy, right? Yeah. And meant being not always coming out looking great in my moments of disclosure. It meant making risky disclosures. And I in my writing group, I remember, one of the women I was in a writing group with was saying, okay, I sort of turned in this chapter and I thought it was so great about Tina and my dad, or about, Divine and me as a...
It was great.
Yeah, but no, I thought it was, and it wasn't. It wasn't at the time. It was an early draft, and they were like, no, we want more we want more vomit. We want more, blowjobs. I mean, they were literally like, put the stuff in there that you're not saying.
There are
because
blowjobs.
There are now. But I do think that there are not to be salacious, not to be anything, and not even to be like disclosing about my life, but to really talk about how, in that case, right, how the divas help you be in your body. Yeah. And sometimes that's a mess. And sometimes you're clumsy. And sometimes it's risky, but also it's exhilarating.
I think you pull it off beautifully, because I think, what you just said is so, it's so brilliant, because it's very hard, I think, probably as a writer when you're doing memoir, to think about like, how and why am I saying something about myself here? Yeah. And how does this serve the story, right? We're used to read, again, there's a lot of books now where people talk about, writers will talk about famous performers through a biographical lens. This is what the performer meant to me. And on the one hand, that's totally fun to read. You learn two things at once. On the other hand, it does, I think, raise these problems of, when am I disclosing in the interest of my story, as opposed to just like putting myself on the page.
Absolutely. And memoirists talk about this all the time, right? Vivian Gornick's favorite, sort of famous saying of like, is it, you want to say the story, not the situation, or make the distinction between the two. And I think for me, I was writing these essays. Some of them began as like scholarly investigations, and some of them began just as thoughts about my own life. And when I was really trying to write the book, I thought, well, how to make it cohere was to sort of put my moments in my life in there, but moments that, again, were aimed at really showing in a really sometimes very kind of textured, quotidian way how the divas were impacting my journey, right? As a scholar, right? As a poet, as a mother, as a friend, as someone who, wanted to be a feminist, right? I think that's what often guided what I chose to include.
So it was, in terms of the process, it was the divas came first, and then you're feeling like there's a tissue here. Yeah. And it's also through your fandom. I mean, through your pleasure.
Through pleasure, absolutely. And there's a lot of pleasure in the book, right?
There's a lot of pleasure.
And it's also was important for me to figure out, well, my role had to stay clear, which was my role is as the diva acolyte in this book. It's not, people ask me all the time, are you a diva? And I'm like, if you ask my husband and my kid, maybe they would say yes, absolutely. But in the book, I really am the stumbling acolyte. And that was important for me so that the reader could also have like somebody's hand to hold.
Right, you are a guide. You're
the guide who's like trying to find her way, and in sincere ways, right? Really, and it did reflect, I think, how my relationship with these divas really did develop over time.
If you know Deb's book, Year of the Dog, you know that is a poetry collection that incorporates images. It has photographs in it, and you are creative with the images. It's not just images, but you have an artistic hand in the way that you use those images. That also is I want to talk to you about, like, do you just document your life through photography? And, how did the desire for having the photo, some of the images are your own artworks, kind of collages, and some of them are just, most of them, if they're not pictures of the divas themselves, are personal pictures, like snapshots from your life.
Yeah.
But they're so beautifully documented, and the pictures are amazing. I think, who takes these snapshots?
I wanted to, because I did want to really inhabit this genre. You know, my books before were either poetry or more kind of scholarly, and I was very interested in a kind of memoir criticism and kind of pushing against the boundaries of both of those genres. I wanted that to be reflected also in the images that I used, and so I wanted to sort of show how the everyday can be lifted up, right? And so sometimes that means it was an image of the bracelet, the charm bracelet that my aunt gave me that's become a kind of like treasured heirloom, right? Or sometimes, you know, I use them, and I think these are my poet self came in probably in a kind of visual way. There's a moment in the Divine chapter when I'm talking about a friend of mine, and there's a metaphor I use an image of the mountain laurel blossoms in Texas because it's a very strong scent and they're very showy. But then, you know, that chapter ends with an image of the pods that are kind of crushed on the ground as a way to also visually convey what happens to this person in the chapter, right? There's a kind of destruction that happens there. And so I tried to use them with a kind of poetic sensibility. And that one was not a photograph. We found it from like some Texas agricultural.
I was like, oh, how did you get?
Yeah, that one, I was there in the wrong season. I honestly was trying to send anybody to go take pictures of the mountain laurel pods and I couldn't, so luckily.
But there's kind of just, so for example, there's a photograph of you and a girlfriend practicing salsa dancing.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's set in the context of thinking about Celia Cruz.
Yeah. That one, I just got lucky. That there was one of those documented in the 90s.
And it, you know, so the photographs become something else in the context of those discussions. They are not, it's not just a snapshot. It becomes some kind of testimony.
Right. And I think I learned a lot having written what we call documentary poetry, where images and text operate in a way that's sort of greater than the sum of its parts, or not mimetic, not like this is a caption for that, but each one kind of lifts itself up beyond what it might be on the surface. I think I brought that sensibility, or I tried to some of the ways that photographs get used here, so that the photo of Gina and I salsa dancing is and is not about Gina and I salsa dancing.
Right.
Yeah.
It's about kind of, it's about a lot of things.
Yeah.
I won't get into that.
Yeah, it's
like
about
a really powerful image.
Yeah.
People might be surprised to learn, and we can talk about, if you have questions about like who's included, who's not included, who got cut, who didn't make it to the last cut, because they don't want the book to be 700 pages.
It was hard.
Sad for us. People might be surprised to learn that there's a chapter about Venus and Serena Williams.
Yeah.
And they stand out because they are sports as entertainment, obviously, but they are the ones who are not traditional entertainers.
Correct.
They are sports, they are athletes first and foremost.
Yeah.
And secondarily entertainers. Can you talk about the decision to include them?
Sure.
Why it was important to you?
Yeah, it was really important to me to include them because they are and have been since they were girls, right? Young girls and women who are extraordinary at what they do and were absolutely vilified for not just being extraordinary at what they do, but also kind of refusing to be deferential about it, right? Which is we have a history of that kind of figure in sports. But also, I was really interested in thinking about them in the chapter about girlhood, because as I mentioned earlier, in the early 2000s, we have this proliferation of like, every girl should be Hannah Montana, and that's, really like, that's how you be like a good girl, is to be a diva. And this is happening simultaneously to the Williams sisters being girls, who you could argue were like tennis divas, and were vilified for doing that exact thing. So it gave me an opportunity to really talk about how the diva as a figure that's promoted is so racialized, right? Can still be racialized as white, as like the successful diva, but then there's the kind you don't want to be, which is the black girl who's really good at what she does and isn't going to apologize about it.
And in a way, even though there were, precursors, black women in tennis to Venus and Serena, in a way, the field of tennis and what the game means
absolutely
gave you an opportunity to make that point about the racialization.
Yes.
In a way that might not resonate the same way if we have a whole history of
That's
women in
right.
entertainment that we
That's right.
know of as fabulous, right? But they're the ways that their bodies were just intrusions or seen
Exactly.
as, like always.
Absolutely. And the fact that there was more than one of them.
Yeah.
That was the other thing. It was suddenly incredibly threatening. Like, what? We can allow the token one, but there was more than one. Oh my God, there might be legions.
And they're on the same team.
And they're on the same team, and they don't hate each other,
They don't
right?
hate
That
each
they
other.
were insistent and persistent in their support of one another. There wasn't a kind of catty, that was ever performed, right, in public. I'm sure, as
They're
sisters.
sisters, yeah.
there was plenty of fights, backstage, so to speak. But I think that also showed a kind of a cultural anxiety, not just within the very white tennis world, but just more largely that, and this was happening when I had my daughter. So I was like, how do I raise a girl to want to be excellent, but she's a girl of color who herself is brown and black, to enter this world.
Right.
Right.
Who was most fun to write about? Or you can choose your own adventure.
Okay.
Who was most fun to, because you might not like that one.
Yeah.
Like most fun or like maybe most surprising. Like you didn't think it was going to be as fun.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I loved writing about Labelle, which I'd always loved Labelle. It was something that I think people, are like, they're in there. And I'm like, well, Patti LaBelle, known as him. To me, they're obviously that. But because I was really interested in all of their sort of transcendent, Afrofuturist ways, but I didn't know how to find my way in until I realized I was listening to them a lot during the pandemic. And I thought, if I could time travel, I would love to time travel to their concert in 1974, because that's when people in New York City just touch each other all day, and we couldn't touch each other in the pandemic.
Right.
And so for me, there was something that really surprised me, that that's how I was able to write about them, and it was so fun to be in the embodiedness of imagining myself at that concert. So because I had to do kind of speculative work for that chapter, it surprised me what could be possible, right?
I mean, speculative in the sense of putting yourself. So the chapter is kind of time travel because you represent the 1974 concert, obviously based on a lot of research.
A lot of research.
But still, there's a kind of it's still you're narrating.
Yeah,
right?
as if I'm there.
Yeah.
But really, it's obviously tons of reviews that I read and things like that to help recreate. So that was good. I love writing about Grace Jones because she's just so out there, and actually reading her memoir, or her This Is Not My Memoir, whatever is what it's called, back in 2015, whenever it came out, 2015, I think. I realized then this is the theoretical paradigm for, this is my sort of theoretical basis for what I would actually like to say about divas. And so being able to honor her as the person who gave me so much kind of basis for my own ideas of how to articulate what the diva is, that was also really fun to
That's
do.
great. The idea of she's the diva theorist.
She's the
for
diva
you.
theorist. She really was. And figuring that out was really cool. It's actually, I don't need to go to all these dudes, although they were important. I could just use Grace Jones as my theorist.
I hadn't thought about that, but there's a lot of ways of opening up what's a diva, and she does that for you.
She does it, yeah.
You do that, but she also helps you do that. Okay, who's left out?
Okay, so Lena Horne. I had a chapter about Lena Horne on the Judy Garland show. That actually was an academic article many years ago that I was trying to sort of think about and put in there. But in the end, again, this goes to process. It didn't fit in the story. The story, the arc of the, there was the book, my book takes on its own life and its own story arc. And
temporally, she was too early.
Well, she was too early, but also it wasn't even that. It was going to be, I think, rewatching that during the sort of Blasey Ford tearing time. And it was one of those things where it's actually that moment's just not fitting. It was really, and that was painful. I had a whole chapter on being a kid and about my own childhood and about Nina Simone's childhood when she's learning how to play the piano, and her piano teacher and one of my teachers who was a diva, and that was
piano
very
lessons?
painful. No, I just had a teacher who taught me poetry. So it was about
learning
learning how to be an artist. That was really painful to let go because I love Nina Simone. So that was sad.
Also, that's a nice angle on Nina Simone that hasn't really been.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of Nina Simone
Yes,
writing
there's
about
a
Nina
lot.
Simone, and there's
Great.
much more to say, but that's a nice angle too.
Yeah. So unfortunately, again, I had that moment in my childhood covered, and I had some of the things about divas that I would say in terms of training covered in other areas too. So that one didn't go. My gosh, there's several others that got cut that are now escaping me. But those are two notable ones.
Did you think about Beyonce?
Or
you were like, I'm not going there.
I was asked to think about Beyonce.
Oh, yeah.
I was asked a lot to think about Beyonce. And honestly, and I actually think a lot of great things about Beyonce, but she's just not one of my divas.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she's not the one that I go back to again and again. Although I was just listening to the new album, in the car. And
right.
I enjoy her. I've written, I've been on panels about her. I've gone to her concerts. It's not like I'm not in any way a hater, but she's not one of mine. And I think it's partly because, Beyonce, because she has the means now, because this is part of her persona. She's pretty normative in her persona. I mean, in terms of she's like a wife and she's a mother, which is really important for Black women, right? Like, I think there's nothing else that. But I sometimes like them a little messier, I think.
Yeah.
Publicly messier. So that might be. No. And so I didn't. And yeah, she doesn't hit me the way she might.
Yeah.
Those in the Beehive.
Yeah. We have a few minutes if anyone wants to chime in with a question, comment.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would love to hear you chat about sort of the relationship between the diva and the audience and the cultivation. You mentioned at the beginning this importance of space, but it seems like a fine line because you also want to give enough. And then we're seeing, with Beyonce, with the Taylor Swifts, where it's like these parasocial relationships then get created. And when you're these women are commodifying themselves in a really interesting way, that navigating that relationship. Can you just talk about that?
Sure. I mean, to talk about divas is obviously to talk about fandom, right? And many people have. Wayne Kustenbaum talks about kind of gay male, the history of a gay male, kind of Stonewall fandom of the opera diva, right? In really beautiful, evocative ways. And I think that a diva that's often said is kind of constituted by the love of the fan, right? Like the diva can't exist, right? Unless there is a kind of worship there. And because she's divine, right? It is a kind of worship, right? That it relies upon. But I think what's so interesting and has always been for me, if I think about all the way back to my Selena book, I'm always interested in what are the kinds of communities that can get constituted in that fandom, right? Sometimes it's, obviously a kind of survival and within a kind of queer community. Sometimes it's like Latinos being able to mourn all of the devastation in their life through mourning a diva. I think that sometimes it's communities knitting themselves together to be able to sort of affirm the diva's longevity as a way to sort of affirm their own ability to keep going, right? So I think that to talk about the diva always means you have to talk about fandom. And so that was part of why in the book it was important for me to position myself as that fan in various moments of my life, stumbling as I may have been, but still in relation, because in the book there are moments that I talk about myself, but it's not just myself. It's often the diva is that third person in the room, so to speak, or that necessary person in the room so that I could have the relationship with my mother, or so that I could have the relationship with my father, or so that I could have the relationship with all these women in grad school who were women of color and we were just holding on to each other for dear life, right? And so I wanted to also perform that aspect of how the diva can help us consolidate these relations that can keep us alive. Yeah. And yet there's also with Beyonce, right, with Taylor Swift, with Dolly Parton, the capital comes in there, right? The diva also plays into neoliberal values because a diva is a brand, and she really solidified herself as a brand, right? In the 90s, there's, she literally she's a perfume, and she's all the other stuff, right? And Dolly Parton teaches. That's the other person who I would have talked about, if I wasn't focusing more exclusively on women of color, and in the savvy around how to make oneself the brand, right? I think is an important thing. She fits very well into those kind of values. Yeah, like you said.
I saw Dolly Parton at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a few years ago.
That's great.
She was performing for, I can't remember who was being inducted, and she came and sang. but she and she was at the end. So like Bruce Springsteen has been on, and all the Dr. Dre has been on, Eminem's been on, and like then she comes on because she's like that last one, and she does a song, and then she says, "It's five that people have been sitting there for 5.5 hours, and she says, I can perform the next song without a glass of water. I could just do it, and alcohol."
Oh, that is
like,
great.
Oh my God.
That is awesome.
It's
I
on
love
tape.
her.
It's
Oh my
on tape.
God, I love it.
I don't know if they
edit.
tape these and then they edit it because they shouldn't have edited that out because it
that's
was
perfect.
unbelievable. And I was like, I'm now, because Dolly has this kind of I'm just every girl kind of thing.
Exactly.
And then I was like, oh my God,
You
don't
got a
fuck
glimpse.
with
Don't
Dolly.
Exactly. You got the glimpse. Like she showed you. And that's again.
Give her the water.
Give her the water. But it does speak to the diva, right? Like that part of then what is the wonder and the allure is that we don't see that very often. And so then when we get a glimpse into like those little moments, oh, it's just so delicious.
It was a deep flex, and she was there.
deep
She was
flex.
also where she was. No, she was being inducted. What am I saying?
Oh,
she
yeah,
was
that
being
was the year she
inducted
got
into the
inducted.
Rock and Roll Hall of
That's
Fame.
right.
Why I'm saying why did she? She was not performing for anyone else. She was performing for
Yes.
herself. But she also did this whole thing about like little me. I don't need to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was like a whole, and then she came out with this
And
rock
then she's
album.
like, well, I guess I better do a rock album. I remember that. Exactly. She's like, okay, just in case there were any doubts that my skills are capacious.
But it was like her right to be,
Yeah.
It was stunning.
It's stunning.
And I wasn't prepared for it.
Yeah, I have to say, listening to that wonderful podcast about her, Dolly Parton's America, that came out. The one moment about Dolly that always stays with me is when she's on the Porter Wagner show and she's obviously trying to get out, and so she's like, "Okay, I'm going to give you this song. I'm going to give you, I Will Always Love You." And you see how the sheer savvy and survival instincts of this person is literally keeping me hostage here. So I'm going to give him this thing that he will look like I'm, undying love, so that I can get the hell out and keep my star and keep myself financially, on my, I can be free financially, I can be free all these things. And I just felt like that moment was so telling of this extreme, almost cunning, I know how I'm going to do this, right? And that is also part of her virtuosity, right?
Yeah.
That acumen in that regard.
It's interesting because I feel like a lot of the figures in the book, I'm trying to remember all of them, are this is something Daphne Brooks writes about in her book, Liner Notes for the Revolution, is that these are figures who are central but also marginalized.
Absolutely.
Dolly's I don't know.
Yeah,
these are names, but when you say Labelle, when you say Grace Jones,
Yeah.
that's also generational.
It's generational, but it's still
Celia
not.
Cruz.
Yeah.
Trying to think of.
They are not women who we, kind of keep in the pantheon all the time.
Aretha's the exception.
Yeah,
in
of
some
course.
ways there. Labelle.
Yeah.
They're extraordinary. They're wildly famous in some ways, but they're also still.
Absolutely. They're still marginalized in some really important ways. And I wanted to honor them and point to that, right? Absolutely.
One last question.
Yeah.
Anyone have a
Any
question?
question?
Okay, can you tell us about the title, American Diva? Why American Diva?
So
It's a great title.
So part of what this book was about is also thinking about my own relationship to Americanness, the diva's own relationships to kind of American ideals of freedom, to sort of freedom movements within the United States. And, I talk about listening, hearing the sound of a diva's voice, right, was how I discovered I was Mexican, I think the first line of the book, because I'm in the neighborhood and I'm learning I'm Mexican-American and my dad plays the music so loud and now everybody's going to know we're Mexican. It's duh, they already did. But learning how to navigate, right, to navigate the neighborhood meant to learning how to navigate being a woman of color and being a Mexican-American woman in the United States. So for me, American Diva kind of plays off of that idea of Americanness and ideals of freedom and how divas really help us engage with that and how they've helped us for a long time, whether we've acknowledged it or not, popular divas. And it's also, about the popularity, kind of the popular, not just rarefied opera divas too. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you,
for this
Gayle. Thank you.
conversation.
Please, everyone, read Gayle's work. It's amazing. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.